react. You whispering my name, thinking I won't be the same. Turn fiction into fact. See what you didn't know, bruises that I'll never show, slipping on your every jab. So tighten up your fist, step into the ring with this. I hope your mama's got your back. First round, you thought you would've knocked me down. Fifth round, bleeding out the side of your mouth. Final round, pulling the sound of my name in the crowd. You hit a buzz. Oh, 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 oh. You hit a buzz. Oh, 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 oh. Just 'cause I took a break, you're making a huge mistake, thinking you can take the throne. Look at you trembling, step into the lion's den. Bet you wish you stayed at home, begging for mercy underneath your breath when I ain't even sweating yet. My legend's written in the stone, yeah. You're crying age in defeat is now your only friend. Even your mama's gotta know. First round, you thought you would've knocked me down. Fifth round, bleeding out the side of your mouth. Final round, pulling the sound of my name in the crowd. You hit a buzz. Oh, 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 oh. You hit a buzz. Oh, 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 First round, fifth round, final round. Oh, 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 yeah.
Hey Nick, Sean Spicer. I understand there's some controversy brewing about how many subscribers you have on YouTube. You have more subscribers than anybody. Then it's probably the biggest, largest YouTube subscription that anybody's had. But also it's not numbers that matter, Nick. And I know everyone's gonna quibble over this, but it's content. It's quality. And your subscribers are amazing. They're great. They're high quality subscribers, and that's really what you have to look at. Don't just focus on the numbers. I mean, if people are spewing a bunch of fake news, just don't get in the mud. They're amazing folks. Their engagement, the way that they like the videos. Anyway, I hope this puts this to the end. I hope that this controversy is over and we know who the real YouTube subscriber champ is, and it's you, Nick.
Hello, and welcome everyone to In Time. Thank you, Mr. Spicer. I agree. The way our subscribers hit that like button, it's just like I've never seen subscribers on any channel hit the like button in that way. It's just so the way they. I think Sean, they're really just got to the meat of the matter. So thank you all for joining us. With me today is Xandering, and we're going to be discussing, chatting with Commander Lance McMillan. Now this is an interesting one. So On In Time, one of the things I really am most proud of is we try to look sort of past what you just sort of see in the headlines, and oftentimes engage on topics that we believe mainstream media got wrong for one way or another. And it's actually not that hard to find, which is depressing. But that notwithstanding, I like to try to look past the sort of the so-called the sexy topics, the if it bleeds, it leads topics, and this is one. Is Andrew, you were talking to me a bit about logistics and your experience with logistics in the U.S. and how our supply chain problem has been happening, and what's made our supply chain so vulnerable to the issues that we've been having. And that, for In Time, that is a sexy topic. I'm going to say it right now. Logistics is a damn sexy topic for In Time, and the reason is because I think it is profoundly misunderstood, and it is not taken as seriously in terms of just how important it is. So I want to thank you, Xander, because you really got me to think about that. So what are your thoughts on that?
Logistics runs the world, runs absolutely everything. It's at the foundation of everything in our world. Our world wouldn't function without logistics.
Well, for those of us who are lamenting the supply chain issues in the United States, we're starting to really see that, and logistics have run so smoothly. But that has, we talk about, I've often spoken about what has helped the U.S. become, the powerhouse country that it is. And I talk, about the energy surplus in the 90s, any number of policy decisions. But one of the biggies is we've managed to get logistics down. Now, if anyone doesn't believe that, one of the reasons that Russia, which is purportedly supposed to have a military, I think it was 15 times larger than Ukraine, is getting their asses handed to them in Ukraine right now. And one of the reasons is they can't get the logistics down. Does that sound fair to you, Andrew?
Yeah, it's definitely a pretty big problem as it got going on.
Yeah, so
kind of hard to prosecute a war when you don't have the supplies to prosecute or resupply to continue prosecuting a war.
Yeah, well, you don't have the missiles, you don't have the fuel, you don't have the and just getting the tires right. And one of the things that Dorito had mentioned, which I thought was interesting, was he said that in a column the size that Russia was sending to Kyiv, in a column that size, at least 10% of it actually has to be nothing but vehicles with parts for all the other vehicles, because they're going to break down on the way there. And if you don't keep them supplied, you have to assume that you're going to lose 10% just on maintenance. You have to be able to rebuild 10%, at any given time from the ground up. So you carry all those kinds of parts with you. And that was just something that had never crossed my mind, and apparently didn't cross the Russians' mind either. So with us today is Commander Lance McMillan. Commander McMillan, how are you?
I'm doing pretty good. How are you?
Oh, doing good, thank you. I've been busy over here, but we've been getting a lot of good stuff done. So people can actually hear me now, I think, presumably. So hopefully everything's sounding right. But that was a harder problem to solve than you'd think. At any rate, so first of all, Commander, for those of us who need a refresher, and you've spoken often. You give us your CV every time. I always ask you just to let our audience know. So I'm going to ask you for that again. But what I think, what I find interesting is your CV. You've always mentioned logistics in it, and this is, other than I think the very first time we had you on to discuss the logistics of the staging for the invasion of the Iraq War. Other than that, we haven't actually really. This is most your wheelhouse. You've been a huge benefit to us. But so, Commander McMillan, who are you?
I'm a former U.S. Navy officer. I served from 1980 to 2005. My specialty areas during that period were amphibious operations and operational logistics. So, as you noted, one of the main things I did was I was one of the lead planners for the buildup of forces in Kuwait preparatory to the invasion of Iraq. I'm a fully accredited Joint Service Officer. I've been to the Naval War College, the Joint Service Command and Staff College, that kind of stuff. So I think I'm reasonably well versed in operational logistics.
All right. So, you would, yeah, I'm sorry. What is it?
I feel inadequate now.
Listen, well, yeah, but keep in mind, well, that's so. Isandering was our expert, but the reality is, he's still our expert because I'm the last man on the totem pole for any of that stuff by any stretch of the imagination. We're very lucky to have you. So, oh dear Lord, where was I? I completely lost my train of thought. All right, yeah, you would. I think it was. I want to say no, it couldn't have been Pushkin because Pushkin was um, uh, the quote: "Infantry wins battles, but logistics wins wars." And I've forgotten actually now who did
The
that
actual
quote. Yeah.
quote is, "Amateurs discuss strategy, professionals discuss logistics." And
Ah, oh, yeah.
it's attributed to dozens of people, from Napoleon to Vauban to uh, Bismarck, people like that. It's all over the fence. So your guess is as good as mine. Who said it first?
It was his andering. Why not? Um,
Okay.
so,
It was
so,
said by that one guy that one time, over there.
Yeah.
no,
Exactly.
yeah. It was like that one. Oh, except I think they do have. There was a Marine who said, "The come on, guys, do you really want to live forever?" But that's not the other one. There's a whole bunch of misattributions. It's always so hard to find. I think you're right. It's hard to find out who said these things first.
Oh, yeah.
So, why do you suppose somebody would say that? That doesn't. What we see in the news has very little to do with logistics, and in time we've been covering it to some extent more than that was one of the discussions we had with that. There was a
Sure.
40-mile column that stopped, and one of the biggest issues, to the best of my understanding, was it was pushing. Yep. Okay. So, now, one of the biggest issues, as I understand it, is dry rot. So you've got these vehicles that are using tires, and in the Japanese vehicles, the tires that they use used to be Michelin, actually. But my understanding is they switched to a Chinese manufacturer that was a lot less expensive, but dry rot is a much bigger issue. And if you don't take those vehicles out and use them regularly, just do donuts, for crying out loud, but go out and use them,
Yeah.
that you start to get dry rot, and then they fail. And that was actually one of the biggest problems as to why that column slowed down and then finally just stopped. They hadn't been using the stuff. So
The Russians, for the longest time, their way of dealing with exercises and so forth is they have a small set of training equipment for each army group or whatever. And if you're going to be training, everybody gets on the bus or train and goes to that training field, uses that set of equipment. Everything else is kept in depots, in storage. It's supposedly being maintained, but for the most part, because of budget cuts and such, they don't maintain it. And it literally sits there for, in some cases, decades before somebody ever goes to start the vehicle again. As I'm sure Sandrine can say, if you don't operate a vehicle, regularly, it's not going to work properly. And that's what the Russians are facing in a lot of cases, is they're taking, Cold War era equipment and trying to press it into service without having proper maintenance having been done on it, possibly with crews that haven't trained on that particular type of equipment, so they're unfamiliar with how to do all the startup procedures and everything. And that just piles up. And if you're not doing the maintenance, it's not just a matter of dry rot with the tires. It's you're not lubricating the axles. You're not putting oil and cycling the engine to prevent it from rusting. You're not changing out gasoline in the tank, so you're going to have water intrusion and who knows what else. So it's going to be a nightmare for them. I mean, if you look at some of the pictures of the broken down trucks, yeah, the tires are given out, but more importantly, if you look, there's liquid leaking out of the crankcases, and that means that they've destroyed the internal mechanism. So even if you replace the tires, they're going to have a hell of a time getting those things to run again.
Yeah, seals dry rot and then start leaking.
Yeah.
Like in gasoline, gas is only good for about 2 years. If you don't use it sitting there, it has butane in it as one of its many components that make it up. And butane slowly evaporates over time, and after about 2 years, there's no more butane. If there's any butane in your gas, your vehicle won't start. If everything else has been maintained really well, you might get it to run on that fuel, but you won't get it to start. So, gasoline especially, diesel's about 3 to 4 years, unless you add a specific stabilizer to try and help. Not running. Nothing was worse than parking a semi truck for a year and then getting back in and trying to run it. There's so many things that go wrong.
Yeah, and you see pictures now of trains bringing civilian trucks to the Army front headquarters to pick up the load for logistics, because so many of the military logistic vehicles are deadline. They're completely inoperative. And so they're taking these trucks, none of them are uniform designs or whatever, and they're just throwing them into the war zone to haul supplies. And that's going to have repercussions downstream once, that impacts their civilian economy. It's just a disaster waiting to happen.
So let's start at the 10,000-foot view, work our way in, because we've seen just a nightmare of problems with the Russian army trying to prosecute this war. But you're in Russia, and you, comrade, have been asked to prepare an invasion of Ukraine. What are the first things you look at, and how, as opposed to how does it appear from, obviously none of us have, we're just sort of looking at this after it's been falling apart, but what does it look like maybe they failed to do? So what would be the first things going through your head to figure out how you're going to invade Ukraine?
Sure. So one of the first things you're going to do is you're going to stage all your necessary supplies near the kickoff point. You want to minimize the amount of distance your vehicles need to travel to resupply the spearheads that you're sending into the opponent's country. And the Russians did this. The difference is that they're using all these trucks to haul the stuff, and to get the supplies to those supply depots near the border, they're having to put them on rail and bring them in. They don't have much of a long haul trucking industry in their country. Everything is moved predominantly by rail. So you've got these little trucks, and unlike our long distance semi-trailers, their trucks are, if you think about it, closer to what we would call panel delivery vans in this country. They're for, traveling 20, 30 miles from a local warehouse to deliver a refrigerator to Mr. Smith or whatever. That's what they're using to haul all of these supplies. They're not rough terrain capable vehicles, particularly if they're in bad maintenance like we know they are. So all of that stuff is road bound, and it's clogging up the roads. It's going to be getting worse now that the spring thaw is setting in. So you can't drive off the road because you'll literally sink into your axles in the mud. So they bring all this stuff forward. When you launch the attack, you want to have supplies staged, which they did by putting them in trucks to go right behind your spearhead, so that when your spearhead starts running low on gas, running out of ammo, your troops get hungry, what have you, you have the supplies right there to take care of those supply logistic type issues. But if those trucks are road bound and are bottlenecking the road, and it becomes a huge effort to try to keep them moving without impacting your spearhead's movement itself. Compounding that is, once you want to load or offload trucks, you want to do it as quickly as possible with as little manpower being tied up doing it as possible. Now, in the U.S., most of our cargo is, and I should caveat this by saying not just the U.S., but in most Western nations, developed nations, cargo tends to be loaded on those pallets. Most people are familiar with the wooden ones. There are also plastic ones, and there are metal ones as well. And so one or two guys using a pallet jack or a forklift can load a truck, even a 40-foot container truck, in a matter of hours, because it's easy to move all of that stuff quickly. For the Russians, if you look in the back of every one of those trucks, none of the cargo is palletized. It's all break bulk. So literally, you have to take Ivan and Pyotr and Vasily and a whole platoon of guys, and each guy is going to carry one box individually and stage it in the back of the vehicle, and then he's going to go out and get the next box. So you got this huge number of people devoted to just loading and unloading trucks at the other end. So that's a huge waste of time. Then there's the fact when we have outsized cargo that we know is heavy and bulky and presents a stability issue in a truck, almost all of our containers and things that we have with outsized cargo, say artillery missiles, big blocks of ammunition, that kind of stuff, is going to have pre-fitted D-rings that are part of that container that's carrying that stuff. The Russians don't have that. They just load it in the back of the vehicle and hope that it stays steady. So again, if you look at photographs, you'll see there's numerous Russian vehicles that kind of, went off the side of the road just a little bit, lost their balance. The cargo in the truck bed shifts, tips the truck over, smashes through the side, dumps live ordnance out on the road, and you have to shut the road down now to get all this stuff done. It's all using a logistical system that's very, very similar. I would almost go so far as to say identical to the logistics system they used in 1945 towards the end of World War II. That's what they're doing.
So after World... Oh, please.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I'll remember the question, so I just wanted to have you wrap that up about the...
Well, I was going to say, and I think this ties into it, and then you go back and you look at what did the Russians do in World War II. When they launched an offensive, it typically would go a distance of about 90 to 100 miles before it stalls out. And it does that because it outruns the supply range for those resupply trucks. And so what ends up happening is they end up stopping their operations for between 2 to 4 weeks while they move everything from the old supply dump up to a new supply dump closer to the front so they can repeat the process all over again. That's why one of the reasons we saw the offensive trying to encircle Kiev stall out is it stalls out almost exactly 90 miles from the Belarusian border. Same thing with.
So how far?
Same thing in the Mariupol. The pincers moving out of the Crimea and coming out of the Donbass, heading towards Mariupol. That's about 90 miles, and that's what we're seeing.
So, now, how far can we go, or a Western country for the most part? How far can most Western countries who have modernized their logistical structure go?
It's probably not that much different. It is probably closer to maybe 120 miles, but it stops. But the key thing is that it takes far less time for us to restage supplies for the next bound, and that's what they're called, operational bounds. The boundary that you move up to the next lunge that you go forward. And part of that is because, as I noted, our cargo is easier to offload. Probably 25 to 30% of all military trucks have internal cranes on them. So they're used for lifting heavy items in and out of the truck. None of the Russian trucks have cranes. You have a few very dedicated crane trucks that will accompany like a missile battery, because that's what's needed to load or offload the missiles from those trucks. You can't have two guys carry a missile.
Yeah.
But all of this makes perfect sense when you look at it, because okay, we may go a little bit farther because we have better trucks, but we also have a better doctrine. We also have better cargo handling capabilities, which means we only pause for maybe 48 to 72 hours before we keep moving again, as opposed to 2 to 4 weeks.
Well, and that 30-mile difference is more than 30% actually. It's if they can go about 90 to 100 miles, and we can go up to 120. That seems to me that our bounds are significantly, so we have at least roughly a 30% improvement in the distance that we can make in a single bound, and we can make more bounds in a month than they can by a significant margin, is what it sounds like.
Yep, pretty much so.
Now after World War II, Russia did decide that they were going to modernize their army, and I think again in the 90s they made an effort to modernize their army, if I remember correctly. How successful was that? And did they consider their logistics at all, or their logistics still from the 45s, 1945?
I know I've mentioned it on here before. It's worth mentioning it again. There's a thing called the Potemkin Village, and this is back during early Tsarist era. I can't remember which Tsar it was. Anyway, he had been giving his leading minister huge amounts of money to help modernize Russia, improve roads and make sure there was a new church in every village, etc. And the minister basically, as is wont in Russia, was corrupt and had been embezzling 99% of everything. And then the Tsar one day wakes up and says, I'd like to go on a procession around the country and see all these great modernizations you've done for me. And the minister now starts panicking because he knows that it's going to really quickly come out what's happened. So he builds a portable village and hires a bunch of actors. And every day we know that the Tsar is going to travel about 15, 20 miles to the next village. So they package up the portable village. They send it 15 to 20 miles down the road before the Tsar gets there. And you build the village, and you have all the happy peasants waving at the village. When he gets there, oh, what a lovely village. Then you do it again the next day and the next day. It's a pretend village to calm the leadership. Mm-hmm. And I think to some extent, and the reason I'm pointing this little tale out, part of this is because that's what you see in the Russian military. A lot of money spent on modernization gets lost. People basically are stealing it. And that which does get spent on modernization is often spent on what is the equivalent of a Potemkin village. So the Russians have this fabulous new tank, the T-14 Armata, and depending on which expert you consult, it's radically better than the M1A2 or our tank. Okay, great. The issue is that it's so expensive that the Russians could only afford to buy like a dozen of them. And initially they planned to re-equip their whole army. And they finally had to admit that, well, we can only afford over a period of about 10 years to buy enough to outfit one brigade of tanks with these. And that's what you're dealing with here, is that a lot of the money that gets allocated for upgrading disappears, and that which does go into upgrading is spent on high-profile, glitzy projects to impress, the Tsar, Putin, whoever, and also convince foreign buyers that, Russian arms are still so much better than anything you can get in the West. And you build a few of these, but the majority of their troops are still armed with T-72 tanks. Yeah, they were kind of upgraded, but those are the tanks that they were using towards the end of the Cold War, the T-72 and the T-80, which is the majority of what we're seeing in operation in the Ukraine right now.
So, all right, real quick, Michael Westby, $5 super chat. Didn't get evicted. Thank you for your help, Michael. That's very glad to hear it, and thank you very much for your continued support and for the $5 super chat. We really do appreciate it. And again, glad you're doing well. Peter Buston, I think I got it right. Peter Buston, this is fascinating. Thanks, is Andering. Really? I've been hosting the show for like how long? Thanks, is it? Really? All right. Thank you both for your support. We really do appreciate it. And to get back to the logistics, what are some of the so you've talked about loading, and in particular loading a truck, keeping a truck balanced and
Sure.
stable. So
Yeah. Can I interject
please.
real quick? So
Please.
we were talking about, where the upgrades and everything went. As I was saying, it goes to high-profile, glitzy projects like brand new tanks, brand new missile launchers, fancy airplanes, that kind of stuff. You don't see a lot of money being spent on supply trucks. It's not glitzy. And so you get a lot of old vehicles that are still being used, and you also don't invest, even if you are making new ones, in innovation and new technologies. So if you look at Russian trucks that are hauling supplies for the military right now, most of them have wooden beds in those trucks.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you put a big heavy crate of ammunition or missiles or something, it cracks the wood. That makes it even more unstable. That means the cargo is likely to shift. You have a disaster and you end up with no truck and a lost cargo. It all adds up. This is a giant cascading catastrophe. Any one tiny bit you could probably get by and survive it. But when you have all of these little things stacking up, you're in a non-recoverable mess.
So
go ahead.
Peter came back. Oops, goes without saying. Yeah, well, listen, no, we're very lucky to have his Andrew. He's always self-deprecating there, but thank God for somebody who makes the show respectable, because it ain't going to be me. All right. So one of the things I remember, and then I want to stay on Russia for a little bit, and then I want to talk about logistics in civilian areas. But one of the things I remember was people saying, and people who I thought were experts sort of before this started, that the Russian military was a fully modern military and would have absolutely no trouble in Ukraine. Was that the thinking from the U.S. military, or was the U.S. military saying, no, this is wait, or was this something that we're just sort of now Monday morning quarterbacking, going, oh well, it should have been obvious, but at the time everybody was really freaked out because it seems like it should we're watching this and this was not what we were expecting.
There are competing factions within the intel community. There are, in fact, competing portions of the intel community. So what DIA says may not add up to what NSA says, may not add up to what CIA says, and so forth. So everybody likes to go for the easy way to read military capability by counting tanks, looking at the guns, saying, oh yeah, that kind of gun can penetrate this amount of armor, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's really hard to do solid analysis of what are called soft factors. And that's things like training, that's things like doctrine. And we know that Soviet-era doctrine is very similar to modern Russian-era doctrine. They haven't changed all that much. And Soviet-era doctrine was pretty much what came out of World War II. They emerged victorious. They were convinced that was good enough. So nobody really, I think, looked at that level, or at least not in the depth that it should have been looked at, to say, can the Russian army do this stuff? Yeah, their tanks individually, their artillery individually, that's great stuff, but they don't have an NCO corps, and that's important because it means all decision making has to be pushed up the chain before somebody will act. You don't have a sergeant or a platoon sergeant, a squad sergeant or platoon sergeant who can say, okay, I see an opportunity. Let's take action now. They have to wait and get permission from above to be able to do that kind of stuff. And that ties
Also,
right. Yeah, go ahead.
Also, not having the NCO Corps means that you're lacking a very valuable knowledge base as well. One of the great things about NCOs is, they're more specific. They're more specialized in specific fields. So they know what in the hell is going on, and if you need to know what's going on, those are the people you go and talk to. Without having that kind of core, there's a bit of chaos going on, and there's a lot of people that don't know what they're doing, and the people making decisions don't have as good a grasp on what is capable and what's actually going on as an NCO would.
Absolutely. But I would argue that also extends into exactly what we're talking about. Because in a Russian army, when you do have NCOs, long-term service professionals, they tend to get assigned to elite combat units. So you get the VDV, you get the Spetsnaz and such. Those aren't the guys that get routed into logistics, so they know how to make those kind of operations run. And again, that means you've probably got bubbas who, have been in uniform for, at best, a year, probably well short of that. The average Russian conscript only serves for 1 year. So, yeah, it's easy to see why things are going to break down. You don't have a subject matter expert who says, oh, don't forget, now that we're loading this kind of missile in the back of this truck, we need to tie it down. And we need to make sure it's not next to this kind of thing, so if there's an accident, it doesn't all detonate and blow up the whole convoy. They don't have people that think in those terms.
So if the U.S. can go, oh dear Lord, and you just gave me the numbers, and I've forgotten how long can the U.S. go in between? Oh wow.
Like I said, that I thought the measurement of our bounds to their bounds, I would guess ours is like 120 as opposed to 90.
Okay, and then how long does it take to? I guess the real question I'm asking is, so Russia has irrefutably completed its first bound. It's not going anywhere for a while. In fact, it's been pulling back. Assuming they decide that they're going to stay in for the long haul on this, how long before we could expect a second bound from them?
If they stopped forward movement, let's say at the end of March, I would guess that we're going to see a resumption of major offensive operations somewhere towards the second half of April. So I would guess around, say, the 16, 17, 18 time period. That's if things are going well.
And this is not... Yeah, please.
Yeah, I was going to say, and the Ukrainians realize this is an Achilles heel for the Russian army. That's why you get these, like the helicopter attack that went in and blew up the fuel depot at Beograd. If you can do that kind of thing, it makes it all the harder to set up your supply dumps for that second lunge.
So that's not, I mean, that's one that I think politicians, leaders try to paint as strategic, like, well, we're going to, we've had some issues, so we're going to shift our priorities, or we see another opportunity somewhere else. But really the problem is a logistical one. There isn't an overall strategy that, it's just they've hit a wall with logistically how much of their battle plan they can actually execute, which strikes me, judging, because I remember the first night of this really rather clearly. I think the expectation was this Ukraine was going to fall in about 7 days. They have accomplished very little of their overall objectives, if I'm understanding this correctly, and it's mostly logistics.
Yeah, but and it's universal. You can't pin this on just the Russian army. For example, take a look at our operation during the invasion of Iraq. About halfway through, we have an operational pause. And it's for exactly that reason. We need to bring the logistics forward. And it, I think, occurred earlier than they anticipated it would. And I think that was deliberate as opposed to unexpected, because that's when those big sandstorms hit. And they said, let's take advantage of this. We can't get very far in the dust. Why not use this as the opportunity to bring all the logistics forward? But it's still, you get, 48 to 72 hours of a pause before the offensive resumes.
So, last question on this, and then I want to broaden it out to sort of more civilian and what may affect Americans day to day. But if you were now your comrade, Comrade McMillan, and McMillanov, we're and I'm almost sitting there going, I'm hoping Russians aren't watching in time, because I just know, like, the advisor to Putin's taking notes. It's like, oh wow, D-rings, really? We should do. Wow, why didn't I think of that? But
yeah, exactly.
If you were there right now, and they're in this mess, and they said, okay, how do we get out of this so that we can do another lunge as quickly but as effectively as possible, and given the restrictions, what would you recommend for them in this case?
I don't think the problems can be solved immediately in the context of what's going on right now. Most of this is longer term stuff. I do think that the military, assuming people on the political side actually listen to their military for a change, and that touches on a whole separate item, which is, who's actually running the military operation right now. If you look at the backgrounds of many of the senior officers, they're not military. They're interior ministry. So they know how to put down riots. They don't necessarily know how to fight a modern war. But I think if you wanted to do something in the immediate crisis period right now, I think what they need to do is, as they have done, pull back, do some deep review and strategic analysis, and say, okay, we figured out, or we have seen, that we cannot bring the government of the Ukraine down rapidly right now. It's not going to be shock and awe, immediate collapse. It's going to have to be a protracted campaign. If that's the case, then what do we want to accomplish in the next month, 2 months, 3 months? Set limited and achievable short-term objectives and focus all your assets on achieving those, rather than just this giant broad front push that they've been doing. And I think by focusing, they have a better chance of being able to pull things off. In the immediate term after the war, if you want to correct some of the systemic problems, I would start, and this is going to sound strange, but I'll say it anyway. Russia has a lot of or did before the war, I think many of them have left, a lot of good computer people. And one of the things that we've been using to great success in our military is the whole idea of QRF codes. Everything has those little barcodes. You scan the supplies in. As they come to the supply depot, You know exactly where you've stowed them in the supply depot. When somebody at the front says, I need a resupply of Sagar missiles, you look up on your little computer, where are they? They're in the container that's on the second row of the fourth stack in this area. So you send somebody there, they get their forklift, they offload it, throw it in the back of a truck and say, you're going to this unit, which is at this location. Everything is automated. And the Russians aren't doing that. It's all manual input. And I mean, with the US military, those supply trucks, when they leave the supply depot to go resupply the troops at the front, they pass through automatic QRF scanners. They don't even need somebody to be running, a reader over the barcode. It's all using little QRF code chips. So it's completely hands off, and it tells you exactly where that shipment is at any given time. So it left the supply depot at time X. It arrived at the midpoint at time Y. It is anticipated based on road speed and congestion, based on the traffic reporting system we have automated, etc. It should arrive at the frontline unit at this time. And you can track that stuff. It's all streamlined. It's all automated. And I think that would be the quickest fix to at least start addressing some of their problems. You don't have to wait for a purchase of another 50,000 upgraded trucks or something. This is all stuff that can be done kind of commercial off the shelf, because as I'm sure Sandring will tell you, a lot of this technology is currently in use in the civilian sector in virtually every Western country. But the Russians are still, working on clipboard and pencil.
Well, Uber's doing it. UPS is doing it. I mean, Amazon. It sounds like Amazon would be a better logistical solution for what you were talking about. Okay, yeah, well, there's a pallet of missiles. This is where you can find it. I was just like, it sounds like what they do at Amazon. Only it's I mean, the product's changed.
The military, just as I was getting ready to retire, about 5 years before I did, they were already talking about how to fully automate all this stuff and go to a supply on not even demand, but predictive supply. So you knew based on reports that a unit that was fighting in this sector was likely to be expending ammunition or consuming this amount of gasoline at this rate. And based on that, you knew exactly when they would need to be resupplied so they didn't run dry. So everything was already in motion towards them. And that's kind of where we are now in our civilian sector here, is we kind of know, okay, Safeway needs another 200 gallons of milk by date X because the current ones that they have on hand are going to be expiring at date Y. That kind of stuff. And there's nothing like that going on with our good funds in Russia.
So, and that's actually a perfect segue. So thank you. But I do want to. I remember one of the ones that got me thinking about it in particular, logistics in a different way, was the understanding that everybody likes to, when you give to charity, everybody likes to give to organizations that'll give food or medical services to people in need of it, and that's important. That's absolutely important. But it turns out in the countries that need the most help, the biggest problem is the roads. They have food. They actually do have it, but they can't get it there because the roads are so bad. It takes so long to do it. The food either goes bad before it gets there, or you can't carry any huge amounts of it because the roads are just unsuitable for carrying any significant amount of. So if you really want to save lives, fix the roads.
One of the things that I dealt with when I was still on active duty, I was the XO of the ship that was the first ship to put U.S. troops into Somalia. And this is well before Black Hawk Down. Anyway, we went in, and one of the things that stunned everybody is when they went into Mogadishu proper and they opened the warehouses. And this is, we went in to relieve a famine. People were dying in droves from starvation. And they opened the warehouses and they were full of sacks of grain. The issue was, just as you're alluding to, logistics. They didn't have the capability to move the stuff from the port of Mogadishu throughout the country to feed all those starving people. And that was one of the main things that the UN did when it came in, was to have the vehicles. They could travel on those roads that were little more than dirt tracks. They weren't really roads, to get those things to the villages in the worst affected areas. And yeah, being able to move things to where it needs to be is one of the key things about logistics. And a lot of people, I think, misunderstand that. When they say logistics, they think, oh yeah, you need to have X amount of gas and X amount of bullets and X amount of beans. Well, yeah, having the stuff is great. It's getting it to where it needs to be at the right time is the big problem.
All right, so let's. We do have a super chat. I want to do that, but I think that brings Xandering up, because that's actually something Xandering also has a tremendous amount of personal experience doing, and I also want to talk about some of what he's been seeing, because he's actually participating in that system. But $5 super chat to Sinister Porpoise. Sinister, once again, thank you so much for your continued support of the show. It's always really great. Fun fact, in the 1940s and 60s, computer was a job mostly held by women. Yeah, there's the what was it? She had said something else pretty snarky. Whenever I'm looking for either snarky or solipsism, she's going to be in the live chat. She's gonna we'll find it there. Thank you so much, Sinister, for that. So, Xandering, there's been a lot of issues with, and we've touched on this before on other shows. What's causing the supply chain issues that the U.S. is having. And we talk about it mostly from people are either quitting, there's COVID, people are getting sick, there's inflation. What are some of the things that you're seeing sort of from the inside? Because you've talked to me, too, about sort of delivery, pickup, what kind of happens when you get to certain ports and various issues. So, again, sort of starting from the 1,000-foot view, what is it that you're actually seeing as some of the problems, and then what do you understand as maybe some of the vulnerabilities that are causing these issues in the U.S.?
Well, I guess the first thing to understand is the logistics system, especially of the Western world, is vastly complicated. It's got millions of moving parts, and they all have to work together, or things start falling apart. And we've seen with a lot of the different COVID restrictions has interrupted the different ways that factories function, different ways that ports of entry function. It's changed all of this stuff up, and it's not necessarily that it's a horrible idea to have done any of these things. It's just that much disruption without a good, clear plan causes issues. And we're seeing all of those issues roll through. We're also seeing in the economy a shift from service-oriented products, especially in the United States, more towards actual physical goods. And the system was very well fine-tuned towards the kinds of economies that have been running for quite a while. I mean, we're expecting a certain amount of goods. We need a certain amount of services. And a lot of that stuff started shifting. A lot more people were staying home, working from home. And there was a shift in the kinds of materials, not just that we're buying more materials, but the kinds of materials that we're buying are shifting a lot too. So it's a very, very efficient system as far as freeing up capital, for example. And when you're dealing with a market economy, the ability to free up capital and not have it tied up in something that could potentially lose you money, inventory can potentially lose you money, because if anything happens to where you're storing that inventory, you've lost that inventory, all that capital's kind of flushed out the toilet. So you want to, from a business side, you definitely want to maintain as little inventory as possible while still supplying your customers on time and promptly. And we've developed over the last couple of decades a very efficient system at doing that, called just-in-time delivery. It's eliminated storerooms in the backs of stores. There are no more silos of grain outside the store. They don't have any storerooms at all. They're not holding extra inventory. What they have is pretty much what's out on the shelves. And as long as nothing shocks the system, this is an incredibly efficient system. There's very little waste. The capital that it frees up is used for other investments. It's used in other areas. It works really, really well. They've started getting into a lot of predictive ordering as well. It's like we know these specific distribution centers go through this much grain, so they need to order this much grain per month, and that's an automated system. It just automatically places the order to the whatever co-op they're getting their grain from, and generally they'll actually do bids, and they'll just find wherever the cheapest is, and they'll just order every month. They order this much, because over time, over the last 20 years, we've had a very stable, predictable model of goods and services being used in the U.S. And after 2020, that got disrupted quite a lot. There were several different shocks, and it's not just in the U.S. because our logistics system is now tied worldwide. So problems with suppliers in Bolivia or in China or in Mexico, any of these problems, causes a problem with the shipper. The importer can't get what they need. Well, now all of the distribution centers don't have any product to give trucks to ship out to stores. And you start seeing very quickly how fast the system can break down when it has shocks added to it, because it's not a particularly robust system. It's very fragile, very efficient, very fragile. And we've moved away because it's a lot less expensive. We can lower prices by not maintaining so much inventory. But when things go wrong, you see it almost immediately. We don't have the ability. It's like we have 3 days worth of goods. If all logistics shut down, 3 days later, there would be nothing in any of the stores. It would just all be gone, because that's all we have on hand at any given time. And that's slowly shifting now after 2020. We're seeing a lot more people, a lot more businesses are investing in actual inventory because they're trying to keep stuff in stock because they don't have it. So we're seeing a bit of a shift there back. I hate to say backwards, but back towards a more robust system that can handle more shocks, because we're waking up and realizing that while this is an incredibly sophisticated system, it's so complicated and it can be so fragile that small shocks here and there turn into really big waves later down the road, and now people can't buy stuff.
All right, so if I can try to frame this. It sounds like, so what you're saying is, keeping a large inventory on hand has a lot of drawbacks. There's overhead, especially if it's products that would require either refrigeration but it's also, you have to, even in a warehouse, and Amazon is famously, they've got their warehouses, but that's a very modern way of doing things. People have to be able to reach the products they need easily. So a lot of a warehouse space is taken up in just being able to access the stuff, and it's almost like a parking lot where you don't want to have a car that's parked in such a way that it can't get out until you move 20 other cars. So this having that kind of inventory had overhead. It had a lot of inefficiency in the system and risk, because something could happen to the warehouse. It could catch on fire. Things could spoil, or if it's any kind of good that's going to last a while, you could also see trends change. If you stocked up on Cabbage Patch Kids or Tickle Me Elmo or anything like that, and then all of a sudden people aren't interested in that anymore, you take a bath on that. But it provided a buffer, so that if there was some other kind of hiccup in the system, if they couldn't get supplied, you could obviously just be draining from your buffer, from your inventory, as opposed to waiting for the truck to show up. So you'd actually still have goods that you could sell. But now inventories that are kept are much smaller. It's much more efficient. But if there's a hiccup in the supply, store shelves go empty. Is that roughly it?
Yeah. And it's not just in the supply. It can be in the manufacturers too. I mean, you can end up with, one of the things that has to be managed is different droughts in different areas for agricultural output, as an example. And so when you look at areas of agricultural production, it's discounted over what it can produce, because inevitably there's going to be issues. Same thing with farming in like the Pacific Northwest. There's a lot of dairy farms, and even though a dairy farm may be able to produce, say, 30,000 gallons of milk a month, it's never, they discount that because you have cows get sick, you have cows die. There's a lot of different problems. You have a 100-year flood in the Sumas Prairie that wipes out 340 farms. And so, yeah, there's lots of different things that can cause shocks to the system. And the system knows that, at least on those kinds of levels. But what wasn't ever anticipated was the kinds of shutdowns and the kinds of policies that needed to be worked around due to a global pandemic. So that really really makes things a little bit more difficult. Plus, you have different economic activity that's causing uncertainty in certain areas. So, it's really screwing with a lot of the models. So it's caused quite a lot of shocks to our system that the system just wasn't designed to be able to absorb. And we never really, I keep saying we, the powers that be, the analysts, never really foresaw something that could cause that big of a shock because of how big the system is and how, complicated. I mean, it's a vastly huge system. And so nobody ever thought that, there would be a shock big enough to, hit the entire logistics sector. And then 2020 happened.
So, what, in your view, would be let me rephrase that. Are there any efficiencies or any improvements that you think could be done that would improve the logistical capacity and or resiliency of the United States?
Sure, we can make it so that in times of upheaval like this, that we're able to restructure labor in order to more efficiently move stuff through our ports, as an example. I mean, the Port of Long Beach, the Port of LA aren't even open 24 hours a day. So you have ships that end up stacked outside, and it's because labor has a pretty good contract, and it's really hard to change those kinds of things. You have contracts in place that say, these are the hours we can work. And it's very difficult to change things like that. I mean, there's a huge problem with a lot of our ports because most of them aren't 24 hours. And because of that, the way that different drayage companies work, moving containers and stuff in and out of the ports, well, they have certain hours. And even when we saw this with the Port of Long Beach, when they opened it up to expanded hours, you didn't have any trucks showing up in those expanded hours because they didn't have capacity to do that. They didn't have the drivers to do that. So, and even if they did, when they showed up, they still weren't getting loaded because it was, this was all fairly new. They've got some pretty structured systems in place for how the system works. And it's not particularly resilient to change because you're trying to change huge sectors with lots and lots of people in it. And that doesn't happen overnight. It takes quite a while to get that to shift around. If we want to we have to choose. Do we want a super efficient, at least economically efficient system, or do we want a resilient system? Because you can't really have both. In order to have a more resilient system, you need to have stores on hand, especially if we're talking about things like the necessities, food and energy. Those things should be we should be stocking those in depth, so that if there is a shock, we can at least still supply the necessities for life. You may not be able to get your Tickle Me Elmo, but you can at least get food.
Yeah,
So
listen, if you've got kids and you don't give them the Tickle Me Elmo on time, believe me, you'd just end it. It's like be stuck there with a child crying and hopping into your bed in the middle of the night, going, "Why can't I have the Elmo? Life is." Anyways, sorry, you were saying.
Oh yeah, sometimes people have different priorities, and sometimes what's really important to one person is of no consequence to another, which is another reason that when analysts kind of look at things, they look at big picture. They don't focus in. So it's one of the problems of when you start zooming out and looking at big picture things is you find that there's quite a few individuals that it doesn't apply to. But you have to try and plan for some things. So, when you have plans in place and something goes wrong, somebody somewhere is going to be suffering. So the best plan, I think, that at least for the United States, to try and avoid something like this in the future, I don't think it's entirely avoidable because you can't predict things. but you can at least take things like the necessities of life and say, okay, we're going to accept an inefficiency here, and we're going to accept a little bit of added risk here. And especially when it comes to more like food items and things like that, there's a little less frivolity in the system versus consumer goods like Tickle Me Elmo. Everybody's going to need wheat, rice, corn, the grains, the kind of staples. Everybody's going to need that, and there's not going to be a fad that's going to go out of style and leave you holding thousands of bushels of corn, for example. It's all going to be needed somewhere. So accept that it's going to be a little less efficient, economically efficient, but you're going to have a buffer there so that when another shock comes down the road somewhere, you're going to have the depth necessary to be able to cover those kinds of things. And that's really needed if you want to get your supply chain back on track. One of the things we've had an issue with is once you have these problems and you have these shortages, you have these choke points, well, you're creating huge distortions in supply and demand. And that just doesn't go away overnight. Even though you may start ironing out some of these issues, the end user is still experiencing a lot of problems because it takes a long time to work through the rest of the system. One problem at a manufacturer, and you've got 20 points down the line that are now having issues, and those 20 points spread out to all of their different 20 points. And very quickly, you've got a widespread issue that takes a lot of time. It's like just fixing the manufacturing issue doesn't fix the end user issue. It takes time for it to finally build back up. It also incentivizes people to try and hoard because they can't get things. We saw this quite clearly with toilet paper. We were never really in any danger of running out of toilet paper, but because of these hiccups, we ended up people going in and buying pallets of toilet paper. So it changes consumer behavior, and having a depth so that there doesn't seem to be any perceived or real shortages of necessities would be beneficial. And I have a feeling, just looking through the industry that we have right now, there's been a bit of because it was such a shock, what happened in 2020, and we're having such profound issues down the line with it that nobody seemed to have foreseen was going to sure, the crazy aluminum foil hat person in their basement talking about how the whole world's going to collapse. They saw this coming a mile away. They took a look at the just-in-time system and said, hey, this is incredibly fragile, and it's just one shock from completely collapsing and nobody being able to buy anything, and then the collapse of the country because you're going to have food riots. And, so they saw the problem. Of course, I think they went a little too far because, it's amazing the kinds of things that modern economies can accomplish. But they saw that coming a mile away. But most of the people and the analysts that were actually in this industry making decisions, never thought that there could be a shock as big as what happened in 2020. So we're seeing a bit of an overreaction, in my opinion. I think that it's warranted in some of the fundamentals, the necessities for life, energy and food, although they're still having some issues, especially in the energy field. And that energy problems that we're experiencing now with a lot of the rise in gas prices and stuff, it started well before COVID happened. Energy is on a 5 to 7 year cycle. So it's like if you find out you need more energy and you say, okay, we need to ramp up production. Well, you got 5 to 7 years before that production actually comes into end user purchasable goods. So it wasn't just 2020. It exacerbated a problem that already existed with a shortage of energy to begin with. So, you can see in the trend lines that happening, in 2018, 2016 is where that started. And then, 2020 happens, COVID hits, and it's not even, I would say, so much that the Ukraine issue has even caused a huge bit of a problem other than speculative problems, because the trend lines have remained consistent all the way through. This was going to be a problem regardless. So all these shocks have kind of hit the system at a bad time, and I think we're going to see an overreaction in some fields where it really isn't needed, and we're going to see a lot of instability and inefficiencies, and then we'll finally kind of get things ironed out a bit, but we're going to have a lot more inefficiency in the system because people are going to be worried about shortages again. And so they're going to start stocking a lot more in the way of inventory. And in some areas, I don't think that that's necessary. It would be easier to just simply kind of go back to the system that they had before, just with the updated demands for different supply.
All right, I'm gonna kick. We got a Peter Buston, 10 pounds, British sterling. I think the industry has started to move away from the just-in-time model. So I do want to ask about whether or not that's a good idea, and I want to talk to both of you about that. And I think the answer may be different, obviously, in a military campaign versus the civilian. Presumably, unless you're fighting in Eurasia, the campaign hopefully is temporary, and the civilian logistics needs to never stop. But having said that, so I'm going to ask both of you about the model and how the model maybe should be tweaked or applies. But before I do that, I want to make two observations. So first of all, basically, essentially what you were saying, as Andring, was, okay, so toilet paper, there was actually no change in the supply of toilet paper, but the perception of the problem of just like a run on a bank actually caused that problem, and the supply chain was not resilient enough to deal with what really was nothing more than a sudden dramatic change in consumer preference, which was to have pallets of it as opposed to just buying a 4-pack.
Well, there was actual issues with supply, but it hadn't hit the end user yet. And so you had some people talking about, we're having some of these issues upstream. Currently it's not causing any kinds of problems. We think that we can, well, you just made everybody say, oh crap, I better get, our store's not going to have toilet paper, we better go get it. So you have to be careful about what you talk about when it comes to supply shortages. I think that had nobody said a damn thing about the toilet paper issue, you might have seen a little less toilet paper availability, but you wouldn't have thought too much about it because there would have been toilet paper available. But we sparked an actual run on toilet paper, and it's very easy to do when people think that they're going to run out of something that's, they kind of need. So it's pretty easy to cause a public panic because they're just thinking, I better stock up on this. I mean, we see this. You see this in the gun industry a lot as well, and it's based off of stupid things like, okay, well, who is just elected here or there? Oh, well, now there's suddenly a run of ammunition. There's suddenly a run on this because they have said in the past that they're anti-this, so we better get it before they ban it. You see this kind of, and of course it never seems to really materialize or happen, except that there's just sudden large shortages in, say, ammunition, for example. And it's completely consumer driven, not necessarily supply driven. In the case of what happened in 2020 and things with like toilet paper and hand wipes and things like that, cleaning supplies, Clorox, bleach was a bit short too. I would say about probably 75 to 80% of that was all consumer driven, causing any of the shortages that you ran into. The other 10 to 15%, 20% was actual issues in the supply chain of going, oh crap, there's going to be a huge, and a lot of it was anticipated, there's going to be a huge increase in bleach, we need to increase our bleach production. But of course there's a turnaround on that. When you say, okay, we need something and we need to increase the production of this, well, that doesn't mean that tomorrow there's going to be more bleach on the shelves. Because you have to actually produce it, you have to bottle it, you have to transport it. It has to go out to all the distribution centers. Distribution centers need to figure out how they're going to handle this excessive load of inventory because their systems aren't set up to do that. There's you're in an environment of changing needs and desires from the consumer end. And you're trying to anticipate what some of those are in a system that wasn't really set up to be that flexible. It was very predictive. It worked off of models of knowing over the last 20 years what kinds of things were needed where. Well, a lot of that went up into the air, and so there was plenty of supply. I hate to say plenty. There was sufficient supply available, but it was going to the wrong places. And then of course you end up with consumers noticing that there's 3 or 4 bottles less bleach on the shelves when they go in, and they're like, oh, we're starting to see shortages of bleach, we better, so they buy, instead of buying their standard bottle or 2 of bleach, they buy 10. Well, and so that means the next person that comes in is going to say, okay, well, now we're short 13 bottles and there's only like 13 left, so I better buy them all. So you have a lot of issues of instability when it comes to at least perceived or real interruptions in actual supply of things that people actually need.
How much of that panic buying, though, is due to speculation? I suspect a significant number of people that were buying stuff, early in COVID were because, there's going to be a shortage and I can make a mint selling it on my own.
I could be. I'm not sure that I would say that that's as far as I'm going to buy it so I can resell it. I mean, this happens in the ammunition industry quite a lot. And there are certainly people that do that. And if I had to guess, I would say it was about 20 to 30% are going out. They're buying huge amounts of, like 22 long rifle ammunition is a good example of this. There was a big shortage of it in about 2018. And there were, leading up through I think it was 2016 through 2018. It's like you couldn't buy it. And this is really inexpensive ammunition. And the price of it just went kind of insane because nobody could buy anywhere. There was limits put on it. Like you went to Walmart and it's like you could only buy 3 boxes of 22 long rifle because they wanted to have some supply. That one kind of confuses me a little bit. I mean, you're still selling your stock, limiting somebody who wants to buy it. But I also understand, not wanting to cause a perceived shortage and making things even worse. So, it gets pretty complicated. And there's about 25% of the demand there seemed to be for, people who were going to buy it because they saw what was coming, and then they started selling it at an elevated price. And I would probably hazard that it would be a little bit less than that because even though you could clearly see that there were going to be some things that were going to be in demand, this isn't a cycle that's happened several times where people recognized that, what the cycle is going to end up being, and we're able to have enough forethought to do this. I think most of that is, the majority of that is people going, okay, we're having a pandemic. We need cleaning supplies. We need gloves. We need wipes. We need, bleach. We need these things. And so there was some anticipation of going, we're going to need more of this. So they're buying more of it. And of course, the slowly dwindling supplies. If people hadn't started deciding that, I need, a case of toilet paper or a case of wipes now, or 10 bottles of bleach versus my normal 2. If that hadn't happened, we probably wouldn't have had many of the shortages and complete outages in some instances of those products. They would have gotten lower. You would have noticed a lot less supply when you went shopping, but they probably wouldn't have completely run out in some instances. And there were definitely some areas where, it's like you could watch the people, they would put a pallet of toilet paper down and there was just a crowd that mobbed it. It was almost like watching a Black Friday video.
Oh, yeah. But we had people out in parking lots in front of stores here reselling toilet paper during the height of the crisis. It was ridiculous.
Sure, because people recognize that, this is one of the issues with capitalism. It doesn't have much compassion in the system, and it looks for opportunity. And some of this, not all of it, and I'm not even saying it's a huge percentage of it, but there are some dangers involved in things like anti-gouging laws. And we usually see this more in the case of like natural disasters than, I guess you could call COVID a natural disaster, just one that we hadn't really seen in living memory, at least. There's definitely been pandemics around the world before. So not allowing, and they don't happen often enough, whereas things like hurricanes happen often enough that, some of the anti-gouging laws that they have, they seem like they should be really good, except it disincentivizes people to stock extra things like bottled water and stuff, because, one of the reasons to stock extra bottled water is if you have a hurricane and water's needed, you can charge a bit more and you can make up that cost of holding extra inventory plus the risk of maintaining that extra inventory, on the off chance that you get hit in your specific area with a hurricane. One of the things that is a consequence of those kinds of laws is there is lower supply in the area because nobody is interested in taking the risks of stocking that extra because they're not going to gain any reward from it. They can't sell their bottled water for any more than they would on any other Tuesday. So that is a consequence.
I think that's an interesting point. It's not a particularly comfortable or palatable one because it feels like, it runs against the grain of morality. But if you've got a gas station and they have a lot of bottled water because they're selling bottled water every day. But we talked about this in terms of the demand for water and trying to not have an inventory, because the problem is that inventory can get destroyed. You have to pay for the square footage to maintain it, just to have it. You have to pay taxes. You have to buy all that inventory, and it's tied up. Your money is tied up. It's not doing anything but sitting there until you sell it. But if you were permitted to raise prices during a catastrophe, which again, and there's very legit reasons why you're not permitted to do that. But if you were permitted to do that, then people would ostensibly stock more emergency supplies on their own, not necessarily relying on the government to do it, but stocking it on their own, knowing that the increase at a higher level of demand is going to make back the money that otherwise is nothing but risk, because you can only sell the bottled water for $1.75 even in the middle of a crisis, so you can't make back the money that you put into the extra storage waiting for a crisis. Is that roughly the argument?
Correct. And it's very uncomfortable because, price gouging, especially when it's something like I hate to use the word price gouging, because a lot of times it really local markets will set the price of things like that. It's not comfortable, and it seems wrong, and it strikes human beings as just unfair. And when you reality of the situation is allowing that to happen actually creates more supply. Allowing the prices to rise ensures that the usage of that resource is more efficient. It goes where it's really, really needed. But again, there's no compassion in it, and there are instances where people aren't economically stable enough to be able to afford a price increase like that. So even though they may really, really need it, they can't afford it. And that's where the compassion comes in and saying, no, we can't allow this to happen. But it is a consequence of reducing actual supply in that area, because you're not incentivizing anybody to carry extra supplies. And I'm not saying that that's a huge impact on things, but it is an impact. And we've decided that we would just rather have the lower, stock or supply in those instances than, because of our feeling of fairness and compassion. And that's where humans are needed in capitalist systems, because capitalism has zero compassion built into the actual system. When you look at something like say socialism, there's ostensibly a compassion component in the actual system, whereas there isn't in capitalism, and we have to recognize that. And I don't think that it's necessarily a failing.
Yeah, but you're also kind of ignoring the whole issue of crazes. I mean, ridiculous things like, say, the tulip craze in the Netherlands in the 1630s. People were literally mortgaging their lives to buy a single tulip bulb. And it was all because I can sell this to somebody for double what I just paid tomorrow. And, that kind of craze can't be factored in. It's craziness. And I think a lot of what we were dealing with the toilet paper shortage was just that kind of thing. Everybody was mindlessly feeding off of the terror that, oh my God, I might have to use newspaper to wipe.
Oh yeah, that's definitely an issue. And this is one of the issues with bubbles in the economy, and this is one of the strongest arguments for the Keynesian model of economics. Is it's ostensibly there to help when things like a bubble bursts, because people are going to get hurt. Because there's always going to be those kinds of crazes. There's always going to be bubbles that start to build up. There's going to be manias and crazes, and that's inevitable, because that's just simply how human beings work. And so at least that's why I have some sympathy for the Keynesian model of economics. Is it's there to try and help people from getting seriously harmed. Of course, the way that it's been implemented has been horrible, but that's beside the point. Not really due to logistics itself, but it's difficult when you have this big of a shock to the system, and because the system isn't designed to have that kind of shock, it never foresaw having a shock of that size. So, and everything ran really great. I mean, for the last 20, 30 years, the logistics systems in the United States have become nothing but more streamlined. I mean, if you think about the nightmare of trying to get a certain product that has ingredients or parts from all around the world, and it's like it's being manufactured in one specific place. So you have to get all of those ingredients or all of those parts to that one spot so that it can be made. Then that thing needs to be sent to wherever in the world it needs to go. I mean, you have almost an impossible problem on your hands, impossibly complex. And our system has become so efficient and so good that it handled that daily for millions of products. It is amazing the kind of logistics system the West has put together. Go and look at, as your example, go to Somalia and look at the logistics system there and see how hard it is to move something that's needed to someplace else. Then go to any country.
There was a logistics system in Somalia?
Yeah, exactly.
Nobody told me.
It was called somebody packed that stuff up on their back and carried it wherever they thought they could sell it. And hope they didn't get mugged along the way by the dictator's men. So, and then take a look at any Western country. I mean, they're doing almost impossible things daily. It is amazing, the system that we have put together. And over the last 30 years, there hasn't been, 2008 was kind of scary, but that was a financial issue more than it was, a logistics issue, and it affected people's ability to buy stuff. So, I mean, there was a little bit of a rumble there, but it didn't cause the same kinds of shocks to the actual logistics supply chains that COVID did. And it wasn't just COVID itself, but a few of the radiating waves from COVID and COVID policies that also caused issues. There was the perception of shortages, which then caused the reality of shortages. You had entrepreneuring people that decided that they wanted to try and make a buck off of some of this stuff, and that adds complicated issues to the problem as well. So it was not designed to have this kind of shock to it. It ran incredibly well, better than I thought that it really should have for a very long time. I mean, 30 years. So now we're seeing a lot of people, a lot more companies are talking about holding up more inventory, and that's actually causing some problems because distribution centers are built to the size that they need. The stuff that's in a distribution center generally doesn't sit there for more than 3 days before it ships someplace else. It's usually only there for a day. So when you go and look at a Walmart distribution center and you see how big one of those places is, it's like, holy crap, take Mall of America and put 4 of them together, and that's one of the major Midwest distribution centers. And it's full of products of all different kinds. And to your point about using QR codes and knowing exactly where all that stuff is, where it needs to go, when it needs to be shipped. I mean, it is incredible the amount of precision and efficiency that's been built into the system. And that got thrown completely into whack or completely out of whack when we started having shortages. We had trucks that are sitting there waiting because they don't have half of their shipment. We can't send the truck half full. What do we do now? Well, they ended up sending them half full. So now you have further inefficiencies, and you're sending, trucks that aren't completely full. So it's the same cost to transport the goods, nearly the same cost to transport the goods, whether the truck has got 1 pallet in it or it's got 40 pallets in it. So it caused a lot of issues, and people are wanting to hold back a little bit more stock. We are seeing that happen where people are starting to hold back more stock. They're ordering as much as they can to try and hold stock. But the actual distribution center distribution system that's set up, at least in the United States, is not geared around, because most of your distribution centers have been built in the last 30 years. They're not geared around being able to handle that kind of volume and that kind of excess. So, that's causing some issues too. And we're going to see just how much, distribution network is trying to resist this, because it's hugely expensive for them to try to expand, to try and shift their systems. They've got something that's worked great for 30 years. They see this as a blip. It will get over it. And so they're kind of resistant to wanting to change their systems, because they've worked for as long as anybody's been working in those places. The system worked, and then they see 2020 is kind of a abnormality, and of course it really is. But there are other things out there that can cause these kinds of shocks, and so what happens ultimately, what's going to drive this is consumers, and whether they support those areas, those businesses that have extra supply, or if they stick with some places that are trying to be more efficient but may not have what you want exactly when you want it. And the United States has gotten very, very used to the idea of you can go and buy whatever it is you want right now and walk away with it, or have it within a couple of days. So the shock of, I've been trying to buy a bicycle.
Lack of immediate gratification scares people.
Yeah, well, and it not being there, because people have designed their lives around the fact that they can get anything they need within just a couple of days. I've been trying to get a bicycle, and this bicycle, there shortages. It's like when the bicycle that I'm looking for, a specific bicycle, and this is true for many, many bicycles. Go to a bike shop and ask to see what their inventory is like, and it is not good. And when it's like, okay, I want a specific bicycle because bicycles have gotten kind of expensive since I was last really riding. Yep. Well, they don't have them in stock, and when they finally get the parts all together to have a run of bicycles and they put them up for sale, they're sold out in 48 hours. So if you're not on top of things, it can take quite a while. It's like right now they won't even have any availability for frames for the bicycle that I want until middle of June. So, and we're seeing this in lots of, now granted, the bicycle industry took a hell of a hit because, the demand for bicycles shot through the roof in 2020. And those systems that were in place supplying bicycle parts was not in any way equipped for the kind of demand that hit them. It stripped them bare very fast. And some of the bike companies are resistant to trying to build up, or the bike component supply places are resistant, to wanting to expand production ability, because they realize that, 2020 is going to be over, and people, are going to start going kind of back to normal, and now you're going to have a glut of all of these bikes that people started buying through COVID that they're now not using, and they say, hey, bike prices are pretty high, we're going to start selling. And then you're going to have a glut of used bikes on the market, and the price is going to collapse for bicycles. So, people are trying to see through this, and of course the end user doesn't really think about all of these ramifications down the line, whereas a lot of, especially component suppliers are going, you're asking us to come up and spend a hell of a lot of money to expand to meet these demands, these current demands, which we foresee dropping off significantly and going kind of back to a normal. And so this is one of the things that has been just the fact of trying to build extra capacity in the system that wasn't designed to have that extra capacity is expensive and time consuming. And on top of that, most of them aren't seeing this as a long-term issue so that's exacerbating some of the supply issues that we're seeing today. Because you would think that, COVID is mostly, at least COVID policies have mostly completely gone away. I mean, COVID's still out there, but the attitudes toward it are shifting pretty dramatically. So
if we ignored it, we'll go away.
Yeah, exactly. So and it's going to have an effect, but people aren't really seeing that it's going to affect that much. So they're trying to resist this push to expand capacity and to expand storage, because it costs real money to do this. And in 5 years, are we going to need any of this stuff anymore? It's like, probably not. And in probably 10 years, where most people aren't going to be particularly remembering what it was like trying to buy something in 2020 or 2021 or even 2022, because the system will have been able to work itself out. I mean, it is resilient in the fact that it will continue to work. It just has hiccups where you're going to have shortages, and the consumer is ultimately going to decide whether they remember the shocks and decide, that it's a good thing to have depth, or are we going to go back to, being as efficient as possible? And the farther away from the shock we get, and the longer we go without having a shock, the more we move back towards that, just-in-time delivery system, because it is, at least from a capital viewpoint, it is the most efficient system we have. It drastically reduces risk. It drastically frees up capital to be used in other areas. So that's why we have the system we have. I say this all the time. It's like there's a reason the systems we have today are the way they are. It's because somehow that's the way it worked the best. So,
yeah, but it worked the best at a certain time.
Until it didn't anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the world changes, and I think that's one of the big issues is business despises change. And so they are always very reluctant to adapt to new situations. So I think there may be a lot of wishful thinking going on that, oh yeah, it's all going to be going back to the way it was. And I suspect that things will have changed to the point where that isn't entirely possible. I'm not saying it won't go back to at least a semblance of it, but there will be changes.
Well, there definitely will be. I mean, we learned a lot about the weaknesses of the system that we have, and especially right now, the weaknesses, especially at corporate levels. Overseeing large, like at Walmart, for example. The corporate leadership of Walmart. They're seeing all of this stuff because they see it across all of their stores. Yeah. They have all of that data. They know exactly what's going on, and they're making decisions based off of that. Because they see exactly what the consumers have done, and so they're trying to modify their system. So yeah, there's definitely going to be changes, and the question is going to be how long-term and persistent are those changes going to be.
So, let me, Xandring, you had said at one point, and I think this was really insightful and well put, which is, we have prefrontal lobes and we can sort of predict things in the future, but we're actually not very good at acting on those predictions, and we're not particularly good at preparing for things in advance. We're much better at adapting once things go wrong. And so I think, I think we're going to look at it and say, well, we dealt with it last time, we'll deal with it again when it comes up, and we certainly can be prepared, and we do in some cases, but we're better at not better at, I should say, but we're more inclined to just say, we'll cross that bridge when, and then smack. So let me do this. I do have one sort of a minor callback that I do have for a question that I want to ask is Xandring, but before. So let me tell you what I want to sort of just wrap up and ask you guys where you think this country is going. And I think you actually, Xandring, you've already touched on it. And I also want to ask Commander McMillan what he thinks. Slightly off topic, but we've been following Ukraine a lot. If it's really that long before there can be another push in Ukraine, and Putin has to be feeling the pressure from the sanctions and so on and so forth. Can he wait for his logistical capacity to line up, or how badly do you think is he looking for an out? But before we get to that, actually, I do have one very quick and short question / observation. You had said earlier, Xandring, that the port at LA is closed at night. Isn't my understanding is that most ports in most countries are open 24/7 for precisely the reasons that you outlined. And if you send a container from China, it could arrive at any time. I mean, it may arrive daytime, nighttime, and if you want to stagger it so that you arrive specifically in the day, because that's the only time you'll be able to unload. That strikes me as a real huge inconvenience and extremely inefficient. Is that so? Los Angeles, how big a port is Los Angeles? I think it's one of our biggest ports, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it is the biggest port in the United States, Port of LA and Long Beach.
Yep.
And it's closed.
And they've changed.
Yeah.
It was before COVID. It was closed overnight. It ran from I think 7 and 6 in the morning, 6 something like that in the morning till 11 at night, and then it was closed the rest of the time. They didn't have trucks running in and out. There were still port activities going on, but they weren't moving freight during those times because the longshoremen didn't work during those hours.
All right. Well, that strikes me as an interesting challenge. I don't want to get into unions and all that other stuff right now.
You're also dealing with one of the largest unions in the country too, Longshoremen's Union. So you have to deal with the union saying, hey, well, if you want us to work, one of the things unions are good at is trying to get the best deal for their workers. I mean, I would argue as to whether that's actually working out that way, but it's not so simple as just saying, well, why in the hell isn't the ports of Long Beach and LA open 24/7? We had several container ships just stacked up waiting to try and offload. Why are they just sitting there? Why aren't we running this thing 24 hours a day? This is kind of sort of an emergency. I'm not sure I would go so far as to say it was a huge emergency, but it was definitely costing a lot of people a lot of money and causing lots of further issues down the line. It's not that easy. It's like you can't just say, well, we're just going to open this port, because there are so many workers in that port with so many, and they're all union workers, and you have to deal with all of those unions who are going to try and get the best deals. It's like, okay, well, we told you, we negotiated, we said we weren't going to work during these hours, and now if you want us to work, you're going to have to pay us triple time. And they're like, we can't afford to do that. Their money just isn't there to do that. And they did expand the hours, but again, it might have changed recently. I haven't looked back at that. This was a problem, 8 months ago. Even though they had expanded the hours, they opened like 2 hours earlier. No trucks were showing up for that because they weren't getting loaded. They knew that their distribution centers weren't going to be open, so they would go in and load 2 hours earlier, but then they'd drive to their place. Well, they'd have to wait 2 hours until their distribution center opened to unload. So it's not just the ports. The entire system downstream has been set up to run the same way, because they knew that they weren't going to get trucks between these hours. So the distribution centers set up their receiving hours for certain times. So it's like there's so many different moving pieces that you have to try and convince to all work together. And it's like herding cats, because they all have their own interests involved as well. So, when it comes to having big shocks and lining things up and saying, hey, we need to fix this and we need to fix it now, that doesn't happen, because there are too many interests involved. It's not like the government can just come in and say, okay, well, you're all more or less just kind of nationalized, and you have to do what we say you have to do, and you're now going to run 24 hours. You're now going to work all of these hours. That is not the system we have in the United States. Another country like China can absolutely do that. The U.S., they can't do that. So, when something happens in China, they say, nope, you're working these hours, and this is just what's going to happen, and that's the end of the story. So from when it comes to kind of emergency situations or huge shocks where you have to make drastic changes, having kind of a dictatorship telling you what you can and can't do, or what you must do, becomes more efficient. But I still don't think I'd want to take the trade-off there.
Yeah, it's one hell of a trade-off, but that's why we have such a hard time with if we decide we're going to get into a trade war with China, because the president can just move the economy any way he wants to. All right, so what I'd like to do is I have two questions for Commander McMillan, and then I want to see if Xandering has any final points he wants to wrap up on. So, Commander McMillan, thank you once again for joining us. It's always a delight having you on. So I'd like to know, first of all, and we had a question from Jake 4D. What does winning look like in Ukraine right now? And I want to point out that this appears to be happening roughly as you had anticipated, which is the last I heard. The general consensus is that what Zelensky may end up doing is ceding Crimea, but for assurances that are ostensibly as strong as Article 5, without whether or not they enter NATO. I don't know how you could actually possibly do that without entering NATO, but that may land on that. He can keep either Donbass or or Crimea, one or the other, not both, and then probably get some security assurances, because he had pointed out, and I think this is fair point, they had security assurances from the Helsinki Accords, and those were ignored. So anything short of Article 5 is, or that level of strength is probably a non-starter. So what does winning look like to them over there? Do you think Putin's sort of got the stomach for it? And then I also was just, if there are any sort of last minute points that you want to make sure that you hit on, and let us know about why the logistics. I mean, it's great. This is an important conversation to have right now, because I think it's really highlighted with the Russian army being ostensibly a reasonably modern army and being unable to even function. So, your final thoughts on that? The the Ukraine question that I asked and on the logistics topic in general.
Okay. Winning in the Ukraine depends on who you're talking about. So let's do the Ukraine first.
Mm-hmm.
I think winning for the Ukraine means having to accept the loss of some territory. It probably means having to forego their desire to join NATO and probably also join the EU. It means accepting the fact that the Russians will have a lot of influence within their country, maybe not physical occupation and such, but they are definitely going to be under the swing of the Russian pendulum. I think that Zelensky has kind of realized that he can't keep going this way for long. His country's too small to be able to support it, and it's too costly for them to continue fighting beyond a certain point. I don't think they have the economy, the infrastructure, and the population to be able to keep going. I think regardless of how that's going to play out, I think that Zelensky is going to have to start coming to terms with the fact that this is the reality he's living in, and making concessions more than he has been. And I'll be honest, I think he's been making a hell of a lot of concessions, but the Russians are simply holding out for, we want it all and the hell with the rest of you. I think he at some point has to just realize he's going to have to make concessions to bring it to an end before there isn't a Ukrainian left in Ukraine. For the Russians, I don't really know. It's as much a question of how Russia's going to react internally to what's going on as it is a question of how the situation shapes up on the battlefield or in the international halls of power. I think the only way we see an earlier conclusion to this war, and a conclusion to the war that at least does some of what Zelensky's hoping for, is if somebody removes Putin from power. Whether that's done one way or another, I don't think it's particularly germane to the argument. It just means he can't dictate the terms. Somebody has to take it away from him. Because
#dispose with extreme prejudice. Yeah.
Well, I don't think it necessarily will be that. I think it will be kind of a quiet palace coup, and it will be sort of a Comrade Vladimir is indisposed at the moment, and Vasily over here is temporarily running things. And, and he may end up, retiring to his dock on the Black Sea and being in a gilded cage for the rest of his life. That I don't know. I think there's a lot that we can't predict because of the way that Russia does stuff internally.
Yeah.
I think there's also an expiration date for Putin in terms of how long he can continue to do this, because at some point the impact of all the sanctions and the impact even on the domestic economy by itself, with having all of these people being and all this equipment being mobilized and focused exclusively on fighting a war, while their otherwise kind of shaky economy is going to hell in a handbasket, that isn't sustainable as well. I think he needs to start seriously thinking about how much am I willing to give up at the negotiating table in order to emerge from this both with my own head intact and Russia semi-intact. And he needs to, accept reality for what it is. And the issue, I think, is that he has surrounded himself with so many yes men and people who are terrified to tell him the real truth that he has a skewed view of the reality he's dealing with here. And I think at some point it's going to take somebody just walking in and saying, listen, Vlad, you need to pull your head out of your posterior. Now, whether Vlad listens as opposed to says, have a fun time going for that one-way walk in the Beaufort woods.
Yeah. Well, there's a reason they're afraid to tell him the truth. All right. Well, and so is Andrew any sort of final thoughts on the issue of logistics? Anything that you wanted to say before we left that maybe you didn't get a chance to, or just any final thoughts?
There was something I was going to respond to. Let me find it again really quick here. Oh, it had to do about with the Port of LA. Talking about needing to have twice the capacity to cover the times that it's down. And that's kind of true, but there's a limit to the amount of capacity that's there. And they kind of expand to the point of how the system has been currently working to supply things reliably. And then when you have a shock, it's like they can't expand capacity, like add more cranes to offload when they're open. The only way to add any kind of capacity is by opening longer hours. The problem is there's also personnel issues. You have to have people to work those hours, and that's been an issue. And it's all the way down the supply chain. It's not just the ports. So the entire supply chain has been set up to work with the hours that the ports are working, and you have to change everything downstream of it. So that becomes very difficult.
Yep.
All right, well, gentlemen, this has been a real learning experience, and I think this is sort of that hidden. It's the behind the curtains. It's the mirrors that David Copperfield is hiding everything behind, and so much more of what we see and do absolutely every day is tied to this sort of invisible thing that is, as I think you correctly pointed out, is Andrew, basically almost a miracle to see it get done, and then to watch the difference between how the U.S. has been taking its logistics seriously, and Russia. Apparently a lot less so that is eye-opening as well. Gentlemen, thank you both. Now, I do would like to have you back on, Commander, I think next week, next Tuesday, because I know Dr. John Shook wanted to discuss generations theory with you and how that applies to war, and also we were going to do, I think, just a hangout. You, me, a couple other people wanted to just talk either military history or Russian history with you, because for me, it's the Russian history. I studied Russia as a kid. I was just fascinated with it. So we'll sort that time out. But we'll certainly see you next week, Tuesday, and then tomorrow overtime. And I think we're going to try to focus on. We're going to be bringing up stuff that we haven't sort of been hitting locally, but we're also going to talk Russia, the involvement pulling from Syria and what's going on over there, because that's looking to shape up to a nightmare there. So we're gonna fill everybody in tomorrow night. I think actually overtime we're moving to 10 p.m. So tomorrow 10 p.m. Eastern overtime. Look forward to seeing you. In the meantime, like, subscribe. Please do also come onto the Discord, hang out and chat. We usually hang out on the Discord after the shows. I will be in the Discord in about 10 minutes after. So once the credits are done, I'll catch anyone who wants to in the Discord in about 10 minutes. Commander, you are always welcome, as Andrew. Hope you get a chance to as well. And we will see you all tomorrow for overtime. Thank you for joining us.
It'll do. I'll see.